In this course, we are going to learn ASP.NET Core MVC by creating a supermarket management system in .NET 8. And the technologies that we are going to use to create the application are ASP.NET Core MVC, which is our focus, EntityFramework Core, SQL Server, and ASP.NET Core Identity to secure the application. You will need to know a little bit C# and a little bit SQL Server before you can take this course. But the rest of the technologies will be covered in this course while I'm creating the application. So this course is focused on practice and creating the project. You are going to learn all of these concepts while you're creating the application. So if you have learned all these technologies before, but you need a project for you to practice, then this is a very good course for you. If you haven't learned MVC, EntityFramework Core, or ASP.NET Core Identity, don't worry about it. All these concepts, like I said before, will be covered in this course while you're creating the application with me. Let's take a look at the application that we are going to create with ASP.NET Core MVC in .NET 8. We're creating a supermarket management system. If I log in as a user, so tester number 1 is inventory manager. I can log in as inventory manager, and then I can manage categories. I can manage products. Of course, for managing categories and products, we can create, read, update, and delete. So all of the CRUD operations, as well as different ways of data validations, are included in here. We can also check transaction, but I cannot actually access the cashier's console over here. Now, if I log out and log back in with tester number 2, which is a cashier. Now I cannot access categories, products, because these are inventory management, but I can go to the cashier's console. I can see my name displayed over here, and then I can sell any product that I want to sell. For example, if I want to sell some white bread, and I want to sell, let's say someone comes to me to buy 5 of them, and I click on submit button, I'm selling the white bread. And today I can see the quantity before and quantity after, the quantity sold, and the total amount. I can also go to transactions and take a look at all of the transactions that is sold today. I can also print transactions, and now we're printing to PDF and click on save. So this is basically just a export and click on save again. Now let's go to the folder and take a look at our printout, and we have a beautiful report. So you can see that this is not just CRUD applications, right? This is a fairly complicated application where you can dynamically render partial views, and also for transactions, I'm using view component. So you will have a lot of stuff to learn in this course. Now let's take a look at our curriculum. So in section number 1, we are going to learn some basic concepts of MVC and some basic techniques to prepare us to work on section number 2, which is the categories CRUD operations. You can see that while we are creating the CRUD operations, we're going to learn about many techniques. We're moving on to implement products CRUD operations. So this is considered a course project. You are expected to implement everything by yourself with some help from the first lecture. Moving on to section number 4, we are going to implement cashier's console, where a lot of dynamic stuff is introduced. So we're going to render partial view with jQuery. We're going to use CSS to highlight product. And then we have many other assignments included in this section. In section number 5, we're adopting clean architecture. So before section number 5, we're using static repositories to contact in-memory database. So here, we are preparing a use case-driven plugin-based architecture, which is going to help you to build larger applications. Although this application is a small application, but it's good to learn some good architecture to help you to build enterprise-level applications. Moving on to section number 6, using EntityFramework Core and SQL Server. We're going to create a SQL Server data store plugin. Thanks to our clean architecture, we can just create a plugin and automatically the application is going to talk to SQL Server. In the last section, we're going to use identity to protect our application, and we're going to learn about policy-based authorization to protect our application with different permission levels. Okay, we have a lot to learn in this application. I hope to see you in the course. ASP.NET Core MVC application framework is a traditional web application framework. In this video, let's try to understand how a traditional web application framework works, What are the essential things that a traditional web application framework has to do? Let's get started. A web application always has a client, which is usually a browser, and a server. When the user needs to access anything in the web application, it interacts with the browser. And then the browser will send a request to the server to request the web page that is needed. The server will process that request and return that back to the browser. It is as simple as that. It is built on request and response model. The browser sends a request to the server returns a response. Any framework that is based on this type of request and response model needs to do the following three things. First, when the server receives the request, the framework will have to map the request to a function or a method to process the request. So the first step is mapping. The second thing that it has to do is that it will have to let the function handle the request and generate the HTML. And the third thing that it has to do is to return this generated HTML through the response to the browser. So return HTML. Therefore, these are the three things that a traditional web application framework has to do. In this video, let's try to understand why we need a framework by creating a ASP.NET Core application without a framework and see how it works and what problem it has, so we can understand why we need a framework like ASP.NET Core MVC. Let's start by creating a project. By the way, I'm using Visual Studio 2022 Preview Edition so that I have access to .NET 8. So go to New, Project. In the search bar, type in ASP.NET Core. And if you scroll down, you can see this ASP.NET Core empty. Choose this option. Click on the Next button. And let's name the solution MVC Course and project name Web Application. Click on Next and choose the latest framework. By the time you use it, you might be already seeing the released version of .NET 8. I'm currently using .NET 8 with Preview 7. Clicking on Create, keeping everything as default. The application is created. And if we go to our Solution Explorer, you can see this program.cs file. So this looks like it's a console application, right? So if you create a console application, you also have a program.cs file. So you can consider this as a console application. It actually runs as a console application. If we run it, let's see what's happening. You can see the console application is running right over here. And it is listening to this on this port. Right? It's also listening to another one. And the content root folder is this folder we just created. And you can see the hello world content here. Basically, the browser is sending a request to request a web page from this location. And first thing that this application does is that it maps the root URL to this function. Basically, this is a function, and this function doesn't have any parameter. If you have any parameter, it will go over here. And the function returns a string, which is hello world, right? So this is the first thing that it does, right? It maps the request to this function. Secondly, this function processes the request by simply return the string. Thirdly, this string is returned as part of the HTTP response to the browser, and it renders on the browser. As we mentioned in the previous video, a traditional web application framework should do the three things: mapping, handle the request, return the HTML. You can see that even this simple application already does all those three things. Of course, except that it's not actually returning HTML, it's returning a simple string. But we can modify this to actually return a HTML. I happen to have the code created. I have a helper function to help me to write HTML. I'm going to paste it over here. You can see that this write HTML function, it takes the HTTP context, takes the HTML, and then it uses the response object to write the HTML out. So if we want to write some HTML, we can, first of all, pass in the context object. Right, so basically this is a type of dependency injection. We will talk about it later, but the context can be passed like this. And then we can implement the function to write the HTML. So first of all, we can write very simple HTML like this. And we put our hello world inside here. This time it will be header 1. And then we can add a line break here. And we can say welcome to this new world. We close our body and close the HTML document. Okay, once I have the HTML, forgot to name the variable here, we can then call the helper function to write the HTML out. Let's pass in the context and then pass in the HTML string. Let's give it a try. Run the application again. And now you can see that our HTML is beautifully rendered on the browser. We can even make it a lot more complicated. And I have prepared some code here. I'm going to copy and paste it over here, and then we will go through the codes. Okay, now I have two maps. First, I map the GET request to this document. And you can see that this is actually a HTML form, and it has user and password. So this is actually a simple login form. And then this maps a HttpPost request. So basically, when the submit button is clicked on, this form is posted back to this particular URL. And this map post function actually maps this request to this particular function. And this particular function, first of all, get the username and password. It verifies the username and password. If it verifies successfully, then it shows welcome to our simple framework. Otherwise, it spit out the same URL that is spit out in this get function, allowing the user to log in again with the same form. So let's give it a try. Now you can see the username and password. And if I type in Frank, and if I type in a wrong password, click on login, it says login failed. Why it says login failed? You can see that in the else statement here, we have a label and it says login failed. Okay, so if I enter the correct password, which is password, click on login, now it says welcome to our simple framework. But this type of simple framework has a lot of problems. First of all, you can see that we have to analyze the request and get parameters out, which is the data that we need to work with. And secondly, the HTML is in a string and it's very hard to work with. It's very hard to manipulate. Thirdly, the logic here and the view, which is the HTML, are all mixed together. And then you can see that validation is done completely manually. There isn't a mechanism for developers to do it otherwise. The business logic here is also mixed up with the HTML, which is the view. So in a word, everything is extremely tightly coupled. Basically, you just have to do everything in this function. Ideally, we need a framework that provides separation of concerns, where we have a dedicated functionality to getting parameters. We have a dedicated functionality for doing validations. We have a dedicated functionality to work with HTML. We have dedicated place to work with authentication and authorization. So everything has its own place to implement so that we don't have to put everything together and work with this one single function. So that's where MVC comes to rescue. And we are going to cover how MVC works starting from next video. I will see you in the next one. In this video, let's talk about how MVC works in the context of a ASP.NET Core web application. When a user requests a resource from the browser sends a request to the server. After the server receives the request, when we use MVC, the first thing it does is that it would route the request to the controller, right? Because MVC stands for model, view, and controller. Here, the request is directed to the controller. The controller is nothing but an instance of a class. It plays a role of a coordinator. Here, when the controller receives the request, it starts processing the request by calling some other components that implements the business logic. Where that component is, we don't have to worry about right now, But the end result is that the data that is needed will be loaded in something that is called model. In most cases, a model is also an instance of a class. And right now, this instance of class is hosting the data that needs to be displayed on the page. The next thing that the controller does is that it feeds the model to the view. The view basically contains a HTML template. So the controller feeds the model, which is the data, to the HTML template, and then combines the data and the template together to generate the final HTML. Afterwards, the view is returned back by the controller to the browser as part of the HTTP response. So to summarize, ASP.NET Core maps the request to the controller. The controller acts as a coordinator. It loads the data into the model and then feed the model to the view. When the data and the view templates are combined together, the final HTML is generated, and then the HTML is returned as part of the response to the browser, and the browser renders the HTML. After that, the user sees final page. So that's how model view controller works within the context of ASP.NET Core web application. And here you can see that the view is the place where the UI representation and logic is handled. The model is where the data is populated. The controller is the coordinator. Everything has its own place. All of the responsibilities are separated. And this is following the principle of separation of concerns. Different things are taken care of by different components in the framework. For developer, our main goal is to focus on implementing the business logic. And typically, the business logic is implemented in different other components. So I'm going to say application logic, and the controller class basically invokes the application logic. The data is then populated into the model. So let me remove the application logic. Let's keep this picture focused on the MVC pattern. Hope everything is clear for you. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. If otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. We know a lot about the MVC pattern in ASP.NET Core from the previous video. In this video, let's go ahead and add the support for MVC framework in our application here. So first of all, let's delete all of these functions that we added in the previous videos. Let's delete this one as well. So this is minimum code in ASP.NET Core web applications. In order to add support for MVC framework, first of all, we need to add the routing capabilities. The routing capabilities is what is needed for redirect the request to proper controllers, and also the method in the controller, right? It maps the request to the method inside the controller, which we will create in the next video. But in this video, in order to enable MVC framework, we will need to add the routing middleware. To do that, we can say app.use routing. So after that, we will also need to add another one, and that's called map controller route. And I'm going to copy and paste what needs to be done here. Then later we will explain how this actually works. Basically, this is the pattern of the URL that this mapping method understands. And as long as you have a URL pattern like this, it's going to be able to map the HTTP request to the particular controller action method. We will cover this in detail later. With this map controller route method added, another thing that is needed is we need to dependency inject all of the dependent services that's required by this method. Right? So this method itself, it requires a lot of services, which we will need to inject into ASP.NET Core. Otherwise, this method will not work correctly. In order to do that, we're going to say builder.services. So this is services is a collection of services. We just need to add the services that are required by this method into the services collection. Fortunately, ASP.NET Core already have a extension method. It's called add controllers with views. If I hover my mouse over it, you can see that this is a extension method. It says over here, this extension method helps to inject all of the services required by this method into the services collection in ASP.NET Core. So with all of these three things added, the routing middleware, the map controller route method, and the dependency injection to support controllers with views, which is required by this method, our MVC support is added. Now that we have the support for MVC framework added in our ASP.NET Core program.cs file, in this video, let's add a controller in order to handle the requests. As you can see, our controller is the first thing that meets the request. So let's go ahead and add a controller. So there could be many controllers in any applications. So therefore, the convention is to create a folder that is called controllers. And then we can add our controller over here. So right click and add controller. Here we can add an empty controller. Click on add, and we can just keep the name as this, just call it home controller, and click on add again. Now you can see that we have our home controller class created derived from controller base class. The space class comes from the ASP.NET Core MVC namespace, and it has a default method created, which is called index. A public method under a controller is usually called an action method. Any action method is used to handle request. When a request comes into the server, it will be mapped to one of the controller's action methods. So in this case, we have this index action method. So how do we map a request to this particular action method? If we go to our program.cs file, you can see that we have a mapping pattern here. This means that if we provide a URL that follows this pattern, then the first part refers to the name of the controller. The second part, it refers to the name of the action method. And the third part is optional. If it is provided, then it refers to the parameter of the action method. So in this case, we have a home controller. So the name of the controller is home, and the name of the action method is index. So therefore, the URL pattern to map to this particular action method is /home/index. Let's simplify this action method to return a string, just like before. And I'm gonna say hello world from action method, and let's give it a try. So if I go to /home/index and hit enter, then you can see that this hello world from action method is displayed here. In fact, if we remove the URL pattern here and just load from the root, we can still hit the same page. Why is that? Let's go back to the program.cs file and observe this pattern once again. So you can see that this part refers to the controller, this part refers to the action, but both of them has a default value, which means that if we don't specify this part, then the controller is the home controller. If we don't specify this part, then the action method is the index action method. And we happen to have a home controller, which corresponds to this, and we happen to have an index method, which corresponds to this index method. So therefore, if we don't specify any URL, then still this action method is triggered, and the hello world from action method string is returned. If I create another action method, and let's just call it error, and let it just return a string, I have an error here. In order to let this action method handle the request and return the string, we can just run the application and then specify /home/error, and then you can see I have an error here. So therefore, we can say that a controller is basically just a grouping of different action methods. It is the action method that handles the request. So if we look at our first diagram over here, any traditional web application frameworks will need to do these three different things: mapping to a particular function, and then the function handles the request. That's the first and the second tasks. In our MVC application framework, we are able to map the request by using this setup and specify the mapping pattern over here. That accomplishes the first task. And also, we have the action methods that can handle a HTTP request. And that accomplishes the second task. Okay, that's everything I want to cover in this video. I will see you in the next one. In the previous videos, we have used the root middleware and the map controller root method help us to do task number 1, which is mapping. And we have used the action method to handle the request. Now it's time to return the HTML. So let's go to our code and over here, and let's look at our controllers here. So currently, we're only returning strings. We're not actually returning HTML. Let me first of all delete this error method. We're not going to use it. Let's actually start adding views. There are many ways to add a view. You can add it manually, but there's a simple way to add it, which is by right-clicking on the action method and then click on Add View. Let's add a empty reader view, and let's make sure that the name of the view corresponds to the name of the action method, and then click on Add. Now you can notice that a views folder is just created, and then a home folder is created. After that, the index.cshtml file is created. Just like by convention, a controllers folder should contain all of the controllers, a views folder should contain all of the views. And then you will have another subfolder here that corresponds to the name of the controller. So in this case, we have the home controller. So therefore, Visual Studio automatically created this home folder. And under that, it created this index.cshtml file. Any file that ends with cshtml is considered a reader view file. And the name of this file is named as index. That corresponds to the action method inside our controller over here. Now we can add HTML inside the view. So we can start with very simple HTML because I just want to demonstrate how this works. So we can add, just like before, like welcome to home page, add a line break, and then add some descriptions here. This is our new home. After that, let's go back to our controller over here. You can see that this is still returning a string. We want to return the HTML that is defined in this reader view template over here. So how do we do that? We can change this return type to iActionResult, and then we can change this to use the view method. And that's it. So let's give it a try. You can see that HTML is being displayed in our home page. So how does this controller know which view to return without actually specifying? Well, this is all by convention. Just like I mentioned just now, that we have this home controller corresponds to this home folder. We have the index method corresponds to this name of this view file. By convention, if we don't specify the name of the view, then it's going to look for the view name that corresponds to the action method name. In this case, we do have one over here. Therefore, ASP.NET Core returns the HTML inside this file. However, you can specify the name of the view. So inside this method here, you can see that it has different signatures. The third one has a view name over here. So we can specify the view name like this, index. And then if we run the application again, it will still show the index HTML template. And if I change this to, let's say, index 1, then we have to change this to index 1. So this will still make the application work. As you can see, the page is still loaded. However, in this case, if we delete the name of the view, then it won't work because it's going to try to find a reader view file that has the index name. This file currently is changed to index 1, therefore it's not going to work. If we try to run it, then it's going to complain. And error message is very informative. You can see that it's looking for the view index inside the following locations, and it cannot find it. So let's change this back to index. Now if we run it again, we will be able to see the same home page. And let's go back to our controller now. You can see that we're returning iActionResult, but our method here returns a view result. So what is the relationship between iActionResult and a view result? So by looking at this name, you can tell that this is interface that represents the return type for any action method, right? Because the name is action result. And there are a lot of different result types. In this case, the view method here returns a view result. And if we go to take a look at the definition of the view method here, and then if we go to the definition of the view result, you can see that the view result derives from the action result. And then if we go further, the definition of the action result class, it actually implements the iAction result. Let's come back. So any action method can return an iAction result because this is basically an abstract of all of the possible return types, because all possible return types implement this interface. So you can always use iAction result as the return type, but inside the function, you are going to return a specific action result that actually implements this interface. So the main purpose of this video is to show you how to create a view and how to return a view just like this. And then your HTML goes into the result view file over here. Inside the result view file, you can see that you're really dealing with real HTML. It's no longer just a string like what we did before, right? So it's this more manageable, easier to program with. Now, in this course, we are going to create a supermarket management system where we have different products to sell in the supermarket. Each product belongs to a category. For example, different drinks belongs to the category of beverage. Vegetables would belong to the category of vegetable. So therefore, I want to create a categories page that shows a list of categories, which is going to serve as the starting location for managing categories. So therefore, before we finish this video, let's use what we learned to create the categories page. And for that, we can start by creating the controller. So let's add a new controller, and let's add an empty controller, and let's name the controller categories. And usually what is suggested is that we use plural form of English word, right? So instead of category controller, we say categories controller. And then over here, we have this index action method. And now what we need to do is to add a view, right? We're not displaying data yet. We just create a static view first. So right click on the indexed action method, click on add view, and then click on add. Here, just make sure that this name corresponds to the action method name. And then you notice that this categories folder is just created and this view is created. I'm going to copy what we have over here and paste it in the categories index page. And here, I'm going to say categories. And I don't want to use H1, I want to use H3. And here, I'm just going to say we are going to display categories here. So I'm not going to display it yet. We are going to follow through the lessons and eventually categories will be displayed over here. And if we run this application right now, can you tell me how to navigate to categories page? So we're going to do categories, which is the name of the controller. And then we're going to do index, which is the name of the action method. And I'm going to hit enter right now. And you can see categories, and we are going to display categories over here. So let me magnify this. You can see it clearly. So another way to load this page is by not specifying the action method. Because by default, if you don't specify it, index action method will be triggered. So you can see that I can still see the page. Okay, that's everything I want to cover in this video, and I will see you in the next one. In this video, let's talk about passing parameters to action methods. In the previous video, we started creating this categories page. And at that time, we're saying that we are going to display the categories right here. So instead of actually use data to display the categories, let's start by hard coding different categories here. So let me change this to an ordered list. And then I'm going to have a couple of list items. Here, what I want to do is I want to show two different categories. When the user clicks on the category, it goes to the added category page. So for that, I can use a anchor tag. And the first category I want to show perhaps is beverage. And the second category, maybe just meat. So what the URL should be. Let's go back to program.cs and look at this pattern over here. So we have controller, we have action, and then it has an optional parameter over here. This parameter, when specified, will become a parameter of the action method. So we can take advantage of this URL pattern. And let's go back to index.cs.html over here. And we can say /categories/edit. Edit is the action that I want to do, because when the user click on the beverage, the user wants to be able to edit the beverage category. So here, I just want to hardcode the ID of this category. For now, I'm hardcoding number 1, and then the ID of meat is number 2. So since this kind of URL pattern can be already taken care of by the map controller root method, we just need to create a controller action method that corresponds to this URL pattern that is specified over here, right? With the controller name, action method name, and a parameter. So let's go to categories controller here, and let's add another action method. As I mentioned, the return type, you can always use iActionResult. The name of the method should be added. The parameter should correspond to the pattern. So in this case, it's going to be integer, and I'm just going to say ID. I want to just show this ID on the page. So instead of returning a view, I can use a different result that is called content result. Again, this content result actually implements this iActionResult interface. To prove, I can just go to the definition, and you can see that it derived from action result. And of course, action result itself implements the iActionResult interface. So the content result has a property that's called content. I can assign a string to it. So I'm going to say id.toString. Now in the categories page, I have two links that goes to category number 1 and category number 2. And then in the controllers, I'm expecting those links will be mapped to this action method. And then eventually the ID of the category will be displayed on the page. So let's give it a try. Okay, let's navigate to the categories page first. And we see the beverage and meat. So let's click on the first one, which is beverage. And then you can see number 1 rendered on the screen. If I go back and click on meat, we see number 2 rendered on the screen. Let's take this moment and look at this URL over here. So of course, if I put 222, it should display just 222. So what if I put ABC over here? And you can see that it sets this to 0. Why does it show 0 over here? So let's go back to the code over here. You can see that this is integer, and the default value of the integer is 0. So ASP.NET Core does not actually throw exception when the mapping from the URL to the parameter fails. It actually provides a default value. And in fact, is smart enough to know that whether this is integer or not. Right? I can use string as the parameter type. Of course, in this case, it's able to display the string value. But if I use integers and then change this to integer, it will be able to tell that an integer is provided and just automatically convert that to integer. So then what if 0 is a valid value for ID? In that case, we can use optional parameters like this, and then we can use a if statement. We can say that if ID has value, then we're going to do this. Otherwise, we can say no content. So let's run the application again. If I use 1, 2, 3, it shows 1, 2, 3. If I change this to ABC, then it shows null content because it's not able to actually convert ABC into integer. Therefore, ASP.NET Core provides a default value for this nullable integer. And the default value for nullable integer, of course, is null. So therefore, it falls into this branch and displays null content string on the page. And what happens if I don't provide the parameter at all? So I hit enter. You can see null content is also displayed. And that's because this parameter is not provided. So it is supposed to be null, and then again falls into this branch. So we have seen that the parameter is passed as part of the URL like this. Another way to pass the parameter is to use query string. So here we can use question mark with the beginning of the query string, and then we can say ID. So this name ID corresponds to the parameter name. And then we can say 555. If I hit enter, 555 is being displayed. So ASP.NET Core is smart enough to map both URL and query string to action method parameters. We just need to make sure that the query string's name corresponds to the name of the parameter, and then the value will be automatically assigned to the parameter. Of course, here it's going to follow the same pattern. If we use something that cannot be converted into that particular type of the parameter, then it's going to just assign a default value for the parameter. That's everything I want to cover in this video, and I will see you in the next one. So far, we have worked with the controller and we have worked with the view. But other than passing the parameters to the controller action methods, we have never truly worked with the model yet. So as I mentioned while we were discussing the MVC pattern here, the model is what we use to host the data. In other words, the data is loaded into the model, and then the model will be combined to the view, and then eventually the rendered HTML will be passed back to the controller, and then the controller relay that HTML through the response to be rendered onto the browser. So in this video, let's talk about the model. Let's jump back to Visual Studio, and let's start by creating a model class. In the previous video, we worked on this editing category. So I want to create a category model class to represent a category. For that, I'll start with creating a folder, and I'm going to call that models. This is the convention. The controllers go to the controllers folder, the models go into the models folder, and the views go to the views folder. By looking at the web application, you know this is a MVC application which has a models folder, a views folder, and a controllers folder. So right click on it, add a class. So a model is simply just a C# class. We can call it category. And here inside the category class, I want to have three different properties: the category ID, the name, and the description. Here we see the green squiggly lines. This is because this is after .NET 6. I'm using .NET 8, and by default, the application is set to nullable enabled. So therefore, we can initialize the strings to use empty strings. Unless sometimes we accept null values for the properties, then we can use a question mark here to just recognize that as developer, I know sometimes the value of the property can be null. But in this case, we can initialize with empty string. Now, after I define the model class here, I can create the view. So let's go to the controllers and let's right click on it and add the view, add an empty view, and let's make sure that the name of the view corresponds to the name of the action. And now the added view is created under the categories folder here. Here we need to populate it with HTML. So let's go ahead and populate this with HTML. And let's remove the content of the body. We know that we created this model class, and we know that eventually this model class will be combined with the HTML template that is defined in the view. So therefore, we can provide a type here by saying model category. So when I do this, I'm basically just saying that the type of the class that will eventually be combined with the HTML template here is of the type category. I can import namespace, and then you can see the category class name is color coded. And now I can use this in the HTML template. So for example, I can give it a title here and I'm going to say category, and then I provide the category ID. So the way to do that is to use @sign and then say model. So this model is an instance of category, right? So it's an instance, it's not a type anymore. So therefore I can access the properties in it. You can see I have a name, right? I have a description and I have category ID here. So all I want in this video is I'm just going to display the title with the ID like this. So now let's go to the controllers here. So when the request is routed to this particular action method, ID is provided here. Right now, we are just directly displaying the ID on the page. So since we created the view, we can use the view. But we want to combine the model and the view together. So what we're going to do is to create an instance of the model first. So I'm going to say category equals new category, and the ID is ID. And here I'm going to say if it has a value, then I'm going to use ID.value. Otherwise, I'm just going to initialize it with 0. And then in order to pass this category to the view, right? Remember that we need to combine the model with the view. So we need to pass this to the view. So the way to do it is to use this view method, and there are different signatures, right? The second signature has this model parameter. Third one has the view name, and the fourth one has both the view name and the model. So in this case, because our action method corresponds to the name of the view, so we don't have to specify the view name, but we can use the second signature to just provide the instance of the model class. And because the type of this object corresponds to the type that is defined in the view, the data can be then passed into here and then pull out from here. Okay, let's give it a try. Looking at the home page, so let's navigate categories page. Now let's click on the beverage link here and go to the category number 1. And you can see category number 1 is displayed. And let's go to category number 2, which is meat. And you can see that number 2 is displayed right here. So the key things that we learned in this video is that first that we need to create the model class, which is just a regular C# class. And secondly, we want to specify the model class type in the view. And then we can just use it to display the members of the class. And the next thing we need to pay attention is we want to pass the model instance into the view method, which in turn pass this data into the view. Eventually, the data will be displayed in the view. So that's everything I want to cover in this video, and I'll see you in the next one. In the first section of our course, we have covered mapping request to controller action method, return response from controller action method to the browser. We have also covered defining a model, populate the model with data, feed that data into the view, and then eventually the controller returns the view as HTML to the browser to render the page. Since we have covered the 3 essential parts of MVC, we will need to put that knowledge into use in this section by implementing our categories CRUD operations, which is create, read, update, and delete. And of course, in the process, I'm going to cover some other aspects of MVC framework. Let's get started from the next video. Before we go ahead and implement our categories CRUD operations, let's take care of the layout of our views. Because so far, we have created 3 different view files. And in each one of them, we have full HTML markup. And usually in an application, we may only have 1 or maybe 2 different layouts, right? Usually just 1 layout. And every page follows the same layout. Therefore, if we have a way to extract the full HTML out and let each one of these view page focus on what this particular view needs to present, that would be ideal. ASP.NET Core MVC provides this type of functionality, and that is called a layout file. So let's go ahead and create a layout file. Inside the view folders, the convention is to put the layout file in the subfolder. And the name of that folder should be shared. And then we can put our layout file into the shared folder. A layout file is nothing but another type of reserved view file. So just select reserved view empty. Of course, you can go here to scaffold everything, but let's learn everything from scratch. So just create an empty view. And here we can put an underscore here, and let's call it underscore layout. The underscore here, it's not anything special. It just tells us that this is a layout file instead of a normal view file. And in here, you can just enter your HTML layout the way you want it. At this moment, I just want to have a simple HTML layout like this. It has a header area where we can see the title is Supermarket Management. And then I have the body. Right now it's empty. I have the div, and inside the div is where I want to render the content from each one of these actual view files. Okay, so everything specified in the view files comes here. So how do I do that? I can say add render body. This special method here takes the content from the view file and render that in here. So basically, this is a placeholder for each one of those individual views. So with this layout file specified here, let's go to each one of those view files that we have implemented so far. And we need to specify that this new layout file is layout of this particular view. So how do we do that? We can use a code block, a Razor syntax code block with @ and curly braces. And here I can say layout. This layout is a string, and I can just specify the name of the layout, just like this. So with this specified, I can remove the HTML and just provide the content that I want to have for this particular view. In this case, I'm just showing the title and the category ID. And following the same idea, I can go to other views. So here, I just want to show the categories title and beverage and meat. So I'm removing the HTML and its body. And of course, I'm specifying the layout file for this particular view. And now, last but not least, we have this home page. And following the same pattern, we're removing the HTML. And then we specify our layout. So when we have this, the expectation is the content of the view will be rendered in the body of the layout. So where is the body of the layout? Let's go to the layout file here. Here is the body of the layout. You can consider this as the placeholder of the actual view. And then this function is used to render the content of each one of these views into this placeholder. So let's give it a try. Let's run the application. All right, you can see the home page works the same way as before. Let's go to categories page. And you can see the categories page also displays the same information as before. Although the HTML tag has been removed, click on the beverage. I can go to the category number 1. Clicking on meat, I can go to category number 2. So everything is working just as before. So that means our layout file is actually being picked up by the view. Everything seems to be fine. There's only just one problem here. If we use this approach, that means for every single view, we have to remember to specify the layout on the top. And sometimes we may forget. To solve that problem, we can add a view start file. So again, we're going to add a view, which is an empty view, and then let's name it underscore view start. So this file has to have this name. So this is convention of MVC, ASP.NET Core MVC. So clicking on add, and then we can clear everything here. All we want to code here is what we have put under each one of these. So we can remove this and then put this over here. So with this file present over here in the solution, we can delete all of these. Right? We don't need to worry about specifying layout in each one of the views. And let's try again. Run the application. Now you can see just as before, our pages are still being rendered properly. So how does this work? Before a view is rendered, this view start file is actually executed. So when it's executed, it specifies the layout of this particular view, right? And then when we navigate to the categories page, MVC attempts to render this view. And before this view is rendered, again, this underscore view start special reader page is executed and it specifies the layout for this view. So therefore we can say that this special underscore view start.cshtml file is automatically executed before rendering any views. So therefore we can centralize some logic in here. Right now, we're just using that to specify the layout file. Of course, you can use it for other purposes, but for now, we're using it for layout file. That's everything I want to cover in this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Right now, if we look at our page here, it's very plain. We haven't applied any CSS styles to our pages yet. So in this video, let's try to enable static file middleware to support the use of static files like images, scripts, or CSS files in our application. In our application, we want to use Bootstrap to style our application. So therefore, I have gone to getbootstrap.com and go to the download link over here and click on the download button. I have already downloaded all of the files that is needed to be added to our application. So in order to add static files to our application, we need to create a special folder, and that is called www.root. And when I create it, you can see that it shows a special icon. This means that anything that is under this folder will be publicly exposed to the whole world. Yeah, because those are static files like images, scripts, so those files need to be accessible to any pages in the application and also accessible to the outside world. Here, I want to create a subfolder and I'm going to call it lab. So it stands for library, and then another subfolder, and I'm going to call it bootstrap. After that, I'm going to paste everything that I downloaded into the bootstrap folder. And you can see the CSS files, and there's JavaScript files that came with Bootstrap. And of course, they're showing up over here. So now, since this folder is exposed outside, if we run our application, we should be able to just access any of these files through the browser. So let's try to give it a try. Okay, so if we go to lab/bootstrap/CSS, and then inside the CSS, we have this bootstrap.css. So let's go to bootstrap.css. However, it says that the location cannot be found. So what has gone wrong? Actually, in our application, the access to the static files are not enabled yet. In order to enable that, we need to add the static file middleware. So we can say app.use static files. So with this middleware added, ASP.NET Core will be able to go into the www.root folder to locate the static file that is requested. So with this middleware added, let's get a try again. Again, let's go to lab/bootstrap/css/bootstrap.css. And now you can see the bootstrap.css file is loaded on the page. With the CSS file added, let's reference the CSS file in our layout file. So let's go to shared, layout, and then inside the head, we can use a link element here, reference to style sheet. And then here we can point to lab bootstrap CSS and bootstrap.css. Now we can work on making the application look slightly more beautiful. I'm going to add a container class over here, which is a bootstrap container. And let's run the application again and see whether it makes any differences or not. Now you can see it looks completely different. Right now I have 150%, so let's zoom out, and this is 100%. So you can see the home page looks different. Categories page also looks different. Inside here, everything looks different and slightly more beautiful. It has a margin on the left and a margin on the right. And I'm going to copy and paste a header that I prepared so that we can have a menu bar on the top. Okay, I pasted this header over here. And this comes from Bootstrap as well. There's examples, you can copy them and just use them. I created this empty menu bar. And if we want to add some items here, we can add them like this. First, we'll add a list item. And then this is going to have a nav item as a class. And then inside here, we can just add an anchor link. We're going to use these two classes as the class. And we are going to navigate to, let's say, the home page and index action method. And here, we're just going to say home. And we can add another one, which goes to our categories page. So I'm going to say categories. And do you still remember what is the URL that goes to the categories page? That is categories and index. So with this change made, hopefully we can see the beautiful menu bar. Okay, the menu bar is showing on the top. We click on the home, it goes to the same page. We click on categories, it goes to the categories page with the beverage link and meat link here. Click on the category, it goes to the category number 1. Going back, click on meat, go to category number 2. So in this video, we use the static file middleware to support the use of static files. And we have used Bootstrap navigation bars to implement in the menu bar. And that's all I want to cover in this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Another thing I want to cover that is related to layout is the concept of sections. Right now, our layout file works like this. So imagine this is the layout file. We have a render body over here. And like I mentioned before, this is like a placeholder where the views will be rendered to replace this placeholder. So this first view will be rendered over here. The second view will be rendered over here as well, and so on and so forth. But as you noticed, this is just one section in the entire body of the layout file. What if we want to have another placeholder, right? Another section. So for example, on the top, I have another div and I want to specify a placeholder here so that some part of the view in each one of these view files will come into this particular placeholder. A good example is a header. I can define a header region in the layout file, and each view may have different header contents. When they're linked together, the first view's header contents will go into this placeholder, and the second view's header content will also go to this placeholder when we try to render the second view. And of course, the rest of the content will go to the body placeholder over here. Fortunately, ASP.NET Core MVC provides this type of functionality, and that is called sections. Let's jump into Visual Studio and go ahead and implement that. So here in the layout file, if I use a div to surround the render body method, then I can add another div. And inside this div, I'm going to put a section. So to do that, instead of render body, I'm going to say render section. And this function takes a parameter that is the name of the section. So I'm going to create a title section. And then for this div, I also want to apply a padding. Let's say padding at the bottom, size is number 3, so that there is a gap between the title and the body. So then let's go into each one of the views that we want to use the title section, and let's go to home page. So we want to render this into section. Of course, we don't need the line break anymore because we added the padding. So here we just want to say add sign section, and then we just need to specify the name of the section. After that, I just want to put a pair of curly braces and then move content that I need to render in the section inside the curly braces. And with this change, the welcome to home message will be replacing the section placeholder, and the rest of the HTML will be replacing the body placeholder. So the same thing needs to be done in other pages. Here I want to say categories, and it's going to be H3 instead of H1. So let's keep this one without using the section, and let's run the application and see what happens. You can see immediately it throws an error. It says that the layout page cannot find the section title in the content page edit.cs HTML. So when we specify the section like this, it means that this section is a required section. All of the views will have to use the title section. So let's go to edit and put our section over here. And let's move this HTML inside. So with this change, we should be able to run the application. And now you can see everything works like before. We can't tell any differences, but we are actually using the section. So how do we specify a section that is optional? This render section method has another signature which specifies the second parameter to tell whether the section is required or not. So if we don't want all the pages to use this section, then we can specify false. By default, the required parameter is set to true. Let's keep it as default so that we can use title section on all of the views. This seems to be not very useful, but if you have something that you want to place above or below or as the background of the section, then you can just specify in the layout view. You don't have to specify that in every single view. For example, if I just want to add a HR element, then all of a sudden, all of the pages will have this HR element displayed. Okay, that's everything I want to cover in this video, and I'll see you in the next one. In this video, let's talk about a static in-memory repository. Eventually in our course, we're going to use Clean architecture, in which we are going to have a use case layer that encapsulate all of the business logic. Then we're going to use dependency injection to inject the use cases into the controller. The controller will then use the use cases to populate the data, and then does the rest of the things that we talked about before. When we use use cases, the data will be injected into the use cases, and that's a fairly complicated but very, very useful architecture that we're going to learn in the later part of our course. For now, we want to learn the MVC framework. Therefore, in this lesson, I want to introduce a static in-memory repository where all of the data operations are encapsulated. So the data operations have create, read, update, and delete. So all those CRUD operations will be encapsulated in the static repository. And then the controller will use the static repository to retrieve data and populate the model. With this very simple repository, we can focus our attention on understanding the essence of the MVC web application framework. In this section, since we're working on categories, so I have prepared the in-memory repository for categories. Let's take a look. What I did is I added the categories repository inside the models folder. So this is just a simple class. Let's click into it. And we can see that this is a static class, and it has a static list of categories. Because this is a in-memory representation of the data, right? It's in-memory data store. So therefore, we're using a list to host all of the data. So these are the categories that I seeded the in-memory data store. Every time you run the application, you will have at least 3 categories to work with. And then the rest are the operations. As I mentioned, we have 4 different types of operations. We have create, we have read, we have update, and we have delete. This add method is the create. When a new category is passed in, first of all, we need to get new ID. This one comes in, it doesn't have an ID. So we need to figure out what is the maximum ID, and then we plus 1, and we assign that to the category ID of this object. And then we add this category object into our categories list. So this is how my in-memory create operation is implemented. And then of course, this is very straightforward. When we get all of the categories, we just return categories list. Next one is we want to read category by ID. So the category ID is passed in as a parameter. We use link to get the category that has the same ID. If it's not null, we want to create a copy, and then we return the copy. So this mimics an actual database. In a database, the data is stored in the file. That instance of data is never returned back to caller. The caller always gets a copy. In other words, the caller can never touch the actual data without running any statement. So that's why we're creating a copy. Otherwise, we just return this category. The caller, whoever calls the function, will be able to just update the properties of the category, and that affects our in-memory data here. Right? That's why I'm creating a copy of the category. And of course, if the category is null, then I just return null. So therefore, I have a question mark here to say this is nullable. Now comes to the update. We have two parameters. First of all, we need to verify that the category ID that is passed in is the same as the category's category ID. And then I get the category to update. If it's not null, then I update each one of those properties. Here, I don't have a lot of properties. If I do, then I can use AutoMapper to map the properties to properties, which is very simple to use. You can do your own research and use that in your own code if you're interested. Last but not least, we have this delete category. And it's very simple. We use link to get the category. If it's not null, then we just remove from the list. So this is my static repository for categories. And in the rest of this section, we're going to use this static in-memory repository as the data store. And that's everything I'm going to cover in this video. I will see you in the next one. In this video, let's try to understand what you need to do when you want to implement a web page with the MVC framework. Because the MVC framework has a lot of moving parts, the approach that I suggest you to work with is what I call the controller, model, and view triangle. First of all, we want to handle the request with the controller's action method. And then we use our underlying architecture to populate the model. In this case, we want to use the repository that we just created. And then we combine the model to the view, and then we work on the view, right? And the rest will be taken care of by MVC framework. In other words, the view will automatically be returned by the controller in the response to the browser to be rendered. So first, let's take care of the controller. Then let's combine the model to the view, and then let's work on the view. Let's take a look at what we need to implement in this video. In our categories controller here, index action method currently is doing nothing. It basically just returns the index view. And then if we go to our index view for the categories, currently we just have two hard-coded categories. So let's use the category repository that we created in the last video to actually return some real data. Let's follow the approach of the controller, model, and view triangle. Therefore, first, we come to the controller. Because controller has already been implemented, so there's nothing else to do. Then we jump right into the second step, which is to load data and then populate the model. Here, in order to load the data, we can just say categories, right? And how do we load the data? We can use our categories repository right here. And then we can just call get categories. And this one returns all of the categories in the in-memory data store. And now we combine the data to the view. And you have seen this over here. We can just put the model right here in the view. At this moment, we have taken care of the controller and we have loaded the model with data. And of course, we have combined the model to the view. Now comes to the last step, which is we need to work on the view. Because the action method is index, this view corresponds this view because the name is the same. So let's go to this view. So in this view, first of all, we want to specify what type of data we're working with. When you look at the controller, this categories is a list of category. So therefore, we are working with a list of category. So this is the type of the model that the view is working with. Here, we need to import the namespace. Now we have the type of data, then we can use Razor syntax to help us to render HTML. So let's delete this. Here, when you want to use any C# expressions or statement or code blocks, we want to start with the @ sign. And of course here we want to loop through the list that is combined with this view. So we can use for each, or we can use for. I prefer to use for each here. And just like writing a regular C#, you just use for each normally. And here I'm going to say for each category in our model. So this model represents the instance of this type of data. Right? And of course, this one corresponds to this particular object. So now I just simply want to display the name of the category. So I use li element. And then over here, because I have used HTML, the flow of C# has been broken. Here, I cannot just access the category. If I do this, this is not considered as C# expression anymore. I have to use the @ sign. Right? Why do I have to do that? As I mentioned, because I used HTML already, so the flow of C# is broken, so I have to use @ sign. Here, I just want to show the name of the category for now. All right, let's run our application and see whether this works or not. We're looking at our home page, and let's go to categories. Now you can see beverage, bakery, and meat. Those are the seeded data in our in-memory static repository. That means our code is working. We are finally displaying some real data. And again, in this lesson, the takeaway is how you work with MVC. First, you handle the request. So you come to the controller and you deal with the controller. And then you use the underlying architecture components. In this case, we're using repository. It's a static in-memory repository to load data into the model. After that, you want to focus the view. So you come to the view, specify the type of the data that you want to bind to the view or combine to the view. And then you work with reader syntax to manipulate HTML. That's everything I want to cover in this video, and I'll see you in the next one. In this video, let's talk about using tag helpers to help generate links. The scenario is this. This is the categories page where we list all of the categories. For now, we're using an ordered list, but let's replace this with HTML tables. After that, we will generate links within the HTML table. So I'm going to delete this. And before I add the table, I want to be more protective. I want to make sure the model that is sent to this view is not null. And also I want to make sure that the count is greater than 0. Because I know that this model that is combined to this view is a list. So therefore I can use count. So only in this case do we display the HTML table that contains a list of categories. So I think this is called defensive programming, just to make sure that we don't create any exceptions. So I happen to have the HTML. I think everybody knows HTML, so I'm not going to teach HTML in this course. So therefore, I'm just going to copy and paste what I have, and then I'll explain. Okay, I have some bootstrap classes applied to the table. And in table, I have 3 columns, name and description. And this column is empty because in the TD that corresponds to the header, I want to add a edit button. And only when the user click on the edit button do I want to redirect the user to the category page. So I can use a anchor element as well, but then I'm going to apply a button class so that it will look like a link button like this. And then the caption is edit. So here's the question. What the URL is supposed to be here? If we write the URL directly, it would be categories. So this is the controller. And then edit, that's the action. And then the ID here. So for that, one way to do this is to use explicit reader expression. We're going to use a @ sign with brackets. So when we have brackets like this is called explicit reader expression. And then here I can just add any C# expressions. And the C# expressions will be evaluated. Right? For example, I can use plus, or I can use string interpolation. And then here I can add the ID, which is going to be category.category ID. @ sign with brackets, and everything in here is just regular C# expression. With this change, I can try to run the application. Okay, so I have this table. It looks much better than before. And then I have the edit button. And if I hover my mouse over, if you look at the bottom left corner, the URL is actually properly rendered. So if I click on edit, I come to category number 1. If I come to meat, then I see category number 3. So everything looks okay. But there's a better way to generate links, and that is called tag helpers. So I'm going to delete this href, and you can see that we have HTML element, and we have this attribute. A tag helper, most of the time it refers to attribute name.
To use tag helpers, we need to add the tag helpers first.
So we can scroll up. At the very top, we can say add tag helper. I'm going to add all of the tag helpers. And after we specify this, then we can come over here, and if we just start typing, you can already see actually from the IntelliSense that we have all of this attribute start with ASP. So these are all tag helpers. So in order to generate a URL that can be processed by a controller's action method, we can use ASP controller. So this specifies the controller that the link should use. The next one is going to be the action. So we are going to go to the edit action. The next one, we need to provide a parameter. So I'm going to say ASP root, and then you can see this one has a dash. So this one refers to the parameter that the edit action uses. So let's go to controllers. Here you can see that it's called ID. So therefore, here I'm just going to add ID. And what goes here is the category dot category ID. So this @ sign without brackets is called implicit reader expression. The one that we used with @ sign followed by brackets, that's called explicit reader expression. So now we have these three tag helpers combined together to help us generate the same URL that we used the reader syntax to generate. You can definitely use the explicit reader expression to generate the URL. You can also use tag helpers to target certain controller and certain action method in the controller and provide the parameters by using tag helpers. You have different options, and it's up to you what you want to do. I personally prefer using tag helpers. I think it's cleaner. And with this change, we should be able to generate the same URL like before. So let's go to categories, and we can see everything is correctly generated. Category number 1, category number 2, and also category number 3. Now that we know how to use tag helpers, another thing I want to do is to replace the URLs that we put in the layout file. So in the layout file, which is in the shared folders, let's go to the layout file. Here we're just hard-coding the string, right? That's perfectly valid, but I also want to use tag helpers here. And do you remember how to do this? So ASP dash, and the moment I start typing, I realized that I did not add tag helpers, right? So I have to do that on this page as well. It looks like we have to add the tag helpers on every single page where we want to use it, but that's not necessarily true. In the next video, we can resolve that issue briefly. But here, once we add this, we can use all of the tag helpers. So I'm going to say ASP dash controller. So we're targeting the home controller. So I'm going to say home. And then we're targeting the action, which is index. Same thing over here. We're targeting controller, which is categories. And the action is index. Now let's just test it. Make sure it still works correctly. Okay, let's click on home page, still goes to home page. Click on categories, still goes to categories. And that's everything I want to show in this video. I will see you in the next one. In the previous video, we have encountered a problem. So let's go to the layout file. You can see that when we try to use tag helpers in the layout file, we have to add the tag helpers like this. And also when we are trying to use tag helpers in the categories view here, you also have to add tag helpers like this. In fact, we have been experiencing this problem in the past lessons. So look at this. When we are trying to use the category class, we have to import a namespace like this. And we did this in the index file. We did this in the edit file. And in the future, when we work on different other classes, we will encounter the same problem. So is there a place where we can centralize these using statements as well as add tag helpers, this type of statements? Yes, there's a special view we can add to enter the views folder, and that is called _view import. So let's go ahead and add a view. So just add a regular reserved view that is empty, and then we will have to name it as _view imports. And then we can put our using statement, add tag helpers, all of those type of statements in here to centralize them. So let's go into edit. We can remove this, go to index. We can copy and cut this, go to home. Home is fine. Go to layout file. We can delete the add tag helpers. And let's go to the view imports file and just paste it over here. So how does it work? This works a little bit similar to the _view start. However, _view start is used at runtime, right? Everything that is within the view start file is executed before the actual view files are executed. Here in _view imports file, these statements are used at compile time. So once I paste it over here, if we go back to edit, you can see that the category becomes color-coded. Here, category is color-coded, and the tag helpers color-coded as well. In the layout file, the tag helpers are also highlighted. So you can see the purpose of this view imports file, which help us to centralize all of the using statements and add tag helpers, right? We don't have to add them in each and every single view. That's everything I want to cover in this video, and I will see you in the next one. In this video, let's talk about model binding. When we were talking about MVC, one of the steps is that after the model is populated with data, the model is then combined with the view. So this is one direction from model into the view. There is another direction where the data comes from the browser, right? Either the user inputs a URL that contains the data, or the user inputs some data in the page as part of the form, and then send through the request to the controller. In the controller action method, we have to have a way to receive those data, and that is called model binding. We have talked about this briefly in one of the previous videos, but we didn't give it a name. In this video, let's talk more about it. Let's take an example. In the categories view, we use tag helpers to generate the URL, and this is the data that we want to pass from the browser to the controller's action method. And in the controller's action method here, we have this ID, which corresponds to the root parameter name here, ID, and therefore that data is received as the parameter. This in ASP.NET Core is called model binding. And this added action method is a HttpGet action method. If we don't specify what the action method is, it corresponds to the HttpGet action method. Although everything I cover in this video also applies to other type, for example, HttpPost action method. And for model binding, the data can come from different sources. In ASP.NET Core, we can actually specify where the data come from. So in this case, the data comes from the root. So we can say from root. And then if we run the application, we are going to have, it's going to work the same way as before. So go to categories, click on edit bakery. So we can see it goes to category number 2. After we specify this comes from the root, we can no longer pass the data from the query string anymore. So remember in the one of the previous videos, I said that we can do something like this. Now you can see that it shows category 0. No matter what number you put here, it's always going to be 0 because ASP.NET Core failed to do model binding. So in this case, if we want to specifically specify where the data comes from, right, we can actually specify the data comes from query. And if we recompile and run the application, then you can see that category 133, because we specified category 133, we changed to 135, then we can see 135. But in this case, if we want to use root, then we wouldn't be able to use 135. Now this becomes 0. If we look at Microsoft documentation here, you can see that model bindings data can come from these 5 different places. If we don't specify where the data come from, just like what we did before, removing this attribute, then ASP.NET Core is going to go through all of these 5 different places to locate the data. If it fails to locate the data, of course, it's going to do whatever it's going to do, whether it's report the error or it's going to provide a default value for the parameter. It's going to do what it needs to do. Another thing I want to talk about is that for model binding right now, the data is just a simple value. It binds to a simple type. Data binding can actually bind data to complex type. So for example, if I specify category, and then the parameter becomes category. So let me comment out this line. So if I put a breakpoint here, it will run the application and then go to categories. Of course, this link is not going to work anymore. You can see it didn't receive any data. But if we use query to specify category ID is 1 ampersand, name is beverage, and hit enter. Now if we check, you can see it actually received data. Right? Why it received data? It's just because the query string names corresponds to these properties in the class. Of course, we're not going to do this. I'm just showing you different possibilities. Let's roll back to what we did before. Okay. So regarding model binding, we are going to cover a little bit more in the future when we work with forms. At this moment, since we are here, we want to actually load categories from the data store, right? Because right now we're just passing the ID to the category. We're not actually loading the category from the data store. So let's do that. We want to use the categories repository, and we want to get category by ID. Here, we just need to pass in the ID. And of course, this method here returns null if the ID doesn't exist in the data store. But I think that is okay. So we're going to just create the category variable like this. And then here, I'm just going to say if it has value, then I use the value. Otherwise, I'm just going to use 0. So another thing we want to do is let's go to the view, right click
on the action method.
You can click on go to view. It takes you to the view. And now that we have actual data, we don't want to actually display the category ID. Let's at least display the category name. And here we want to be defensive, right? If the model is not null, then that's when we want to render the HTML. Okay, let's run the application and give it a test. Let's go to categories and let's go to beverage. And we can see the name of the category. Go to bakery, we can see the name. Go to meat, we can see the name. Let's do a edge case testing. So let's say that I put in number 30. Now I don't see anything. That is the correct behavior because number 30 doesn't exist. Then category returns null. Here in the view, if it's null, it's not actually going to render anything. Of course, you can provide an error message here. I'm not going to do that in this lesson. In this video, we have talked a little bit about model binding, and then we retrieve the data from the in-memory data store. That's everything I want to cover in this video. I'll see you in the next one. In this video, let's try to use tag helpers to help us to create a HTML form. We're looking at the Edit Category page. On this page, we not only need to display the category information, but also need to be able to edit the category information. And for that, we will need a HTML form. The form tag specifies the method because we want to make a change. Therefore, we're going to use the post method. And for a normal form tag, it has an action attribute. So this is the place where we need to provide a URL. And this URL is something like this. So categories, edit. What this means is that when the form is submitted, it will go to this particular URL to handle the submit form action. However, in ASP.NET Core, there's an easier way to do this because it is always the action method who handles the request. Therefore, it's more intuitive to specify the controller and its actions separately as opposed to hard code a URL here in the action attribute. This is where we use tag helper. We have used tag helper to create navigation links. Here, we can still use tag helper to specify which controller it goes to. In this case, it's categories. And then which action it will go to. In this case, it's edit. Now here, we need to create the name field, the description field. We also need to display a submit button. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to use Bootstrap 5. We're going to use a row class along with a bottom margin. And within here, we can specify the field. And for now, I'm going to have 2 columns. One is column, so this number 2 is the size. The margin bottom, number 3, is also the size. So in column 2, we're going to use a label. And this is where we show the label for the name field. And of course, we can just hard code the name here to specifying the label for the name field. But we can also use a tag helper, ASP.NET Core tag helper, where we can say for which field under the model specified here, this label is for. Here you can see that there's IntelliSense, and we can select the name field here. ASP.NET Core will look at the name field and will be able to generate the string for us when it renders the HTML. And we can provide a class. So we're going to say column form label. By the way, how to use Bootstrap classes is out of scope of this course. So you can check out the documentation of Bootstrap. Next, we're going to add the field column. And for this one, it's going to be slightly bigger. So we're going to use size number 6. You can play with the size and determine what size is good for you. Here, we're going to use an input field. And the type is obviously text. And again, this field is for name. And we're going to have form control for the class name. So we completed the name field. We can actually give it a try and see how it looks like right now. So let's go to categories and let's click on the edit button. You can see the first field is displayed, and let's press on F12 and check out the name field here. You can see with the tag helper, it points to the name field. It generated the ID with name, and name of the field is also name. So because we have the ID and the name here, so when the field is submitted to the controller action method, the model binding process that we talked before is going to be able to recognize to which property in the class this field needs to be bound to. So let's go back and continue to implement the next field, which is the description field. And for that, we can just copy and paste the name field. So here, we only just need to change the field of the name. In this case, it's description for the label. And it's also description for input field. Now, last but not least, we're going to have a submit button. And here, we can also copy this row here and paste it. Now, we want the button to be in the first column, and the second column, we can leave it as empty. So here, we're going to have another input, but this time it's going to be a submit button instead of an actual field for user to input information. And it's going to be a button, and it's going to be a primary button. The value is the caption of the button, and that's going to be safe because this is an edit page. Okay, let's run the application and check out the page again. Let's go to category and click on the second one, which is pick array, and we can see the name and description is properly rendered. We can try the last one, and it's also properly rendered. Okay, in this lesson, we have learned to use tag helpers to help us to create a HTML form. And with the tag helper, it can specify which controller and action method will handle the post request from the form. And also, we learn how to use ASP4 tag helper to help us to specify the field name label and the field itself. That's everything I want to cover in this video, and I'll see you in the next one. In the previous video, we have implemented the edit form, and when the user clicks on the submit button, we're supposed to handle the HTTP post request. So in this video, let's do that. As you know already, when the form is submitted, it's going to go to the categories controller and go to the added action. So let's go to the controller. Currently, you can see that we already have a added action under the categories controller. Will this added action method actually handle that request? No. We need to have all of the fields posted back over here. So the added action that we specified in the added form here will have to be able to see the value of the name field and the value of the description field. So then what do we do when we already have a added action method? We can create another added method with the same name but different signature. Here we want to receive an instance of the category class. And we also need to specify with attribute that this particular action method handles a HttpPost request. You don't specify anything on the action method. The action method handles the HttpGet request. That's by default, so we can delete this. But here, because the HTML form uses the post method, we need another added method that handles the post request here. And when the form is submitted, the model binding will kick in, and all of the fields in the form will be mapped to the properties instance of the category class here. Let's take a look at the category repository here. Here we have a update category method. We can use this method to help us to handle the request. So we're going to say categories repository, and then we're going to call the update category method. Here it receives two parameters. The first one is the ID of the category. So we're going to provide the ID of the category, which is category.id. And here, the second one is just the category object. Direct the user to the categories index page. So this action will go to the index view, which is going to display a list of categories. So for that, we can use a helper method, which is redirect to action. And here we can specify the action name without specifying the controller's name, which means that we are using the same controller. We can say name of index. So this will redirect to the same controller, which is the categories controller here, and index action method, which is this one. So this is going to help us to display a list of categories. And that's what we want to do. Okay, let's set a breakpoint and then run the application with debug. Okay, now we're looking at the home page. Let's go to categories. Let's edit the first one. And let's try to click on the save button, which submit the form. Hopefully it's going to trigger our HttpPost edit method. Okay, so our breakpoint is hit. That means our edit action method is created correctly so far. Now we have the category correctly model bound here. Well, there's only one problem. The category ID is 0. So when the category ID is 0, it won't be able to update the category because we need to use the category ID to locate the method. But if we run through this, we run into it, it will not throw any exception because the category to update is null. And then it will just redirect to the index view, which is the list of category right here. So in the next video, we will have to fix this problem where we don't see any ID of the category. Just to sum up what we learned in this video. So in this video, we learned to use HttpPost attribute to decorate an action method for handling form submissions. And here we use the model binding to receive data that is submitted through the edit form over here. And because the tag helpers that we used from the previous video, ASP.NET Core knows which field corresponds to which property in the category class. So therefore, this category object will be able to receive all of the information in the form. So that's everything I want to cover in this video. I will see you in the next one. In the previous video, we were able to submit a form to the action method that handles the HttpPost request. But we encountered one problem where the category ID here is not actually submitted and remains 0. So in this video, let's resolve that problem. And to resolve it, we have to think about why the category ID is 0. Let's go to the edit view here. And we can see that we have an input for the name, we have an input for the description, and for both of the fields, we do see data in the edit action method. But we don't have a field here that stores the category ID. And that's why when the user clicks on the submit button, the ID is not submitted back to the controller action method, and therefore the controller action method cannot receive that ID. So in order to solve that problem, we can add a field in the form that keeps category ID. But you may say that if we do that, the user will see the ID on the form, and that's not actually what we want. At least it doesn't look good. But we can use a hidden field. A hidden field will still be submitted when the user clicks on the submit button, but it will be hidden to the view of the user. So we can just put it on the top or on the bottom or anywhere. It's hidden anyways. So here we can specify the type of the field is hidden. And again here, we need to specify the value of the ID. And you can think about what tag helper we can use for this. It is the ASP4 tag helper. And here, just use category ID. And that is it. Now, we can set a breakpoint here and run the application again. Now let's go to category and select the first one again. And let's change the category description to beverage category, for example, and click on Save. Now let's hover the mouse over this object here, and now you can see the category ID is properly submitted, and we can see the change of the description. Now let's just run the application. Now it comes back to the categories page here, or categories view here, and we don't see this description change. I found that we have a problem in the update category method in the repository, where we use the get category by ID method that returns a copy of the category. And then we update it. But because this is a different instance from the instance that we stored over here, so therefore it won't actually update the category in the memory. So instead of using the get category by ID method, let's actually use this link query here to help us to actually get the category in the map data store. So let's change it to this one, and then let's run the application. So this time I'm not going to run debug. Hopefully it will just run without any problem. So let's go to categories, and let's this time change the second one. And I'm going to say bakery category. Click on the save button. And now we are redirected to the category list, and we can see that description is changed. Let's click on edit button again, and you can see that everything is running correctly. And that's what I want to cover in this video. I will see you in the next one. In this video, let's work on form validations with data annotations. Let's go to categories controllers, and let's make sure that this breakpoint is here, and let's run the application with debug. Now let's go to categories, and let's choose any one of them. Now if I delete the name of the category, which shouldn't be allowed. You cannot have a category that doesn't have a name. You may have a category that doesn't have a description. So if we click on Save button, now if we hover the mouse over this object here, you can see that the name is null. If we proceed with this Continue button here, you can see that the name of the beverage category is gone. So that's why we will need some sort of validation on this edit category page. That validation should be triggered when the save button is clicked on, and it should prevent the user from saving the category if the information on this form is not valid. We should always validate users' input because users may make all kinds of problems due to different reasons. One way to do form validations is to use data annotations. And to do that, let's stop debugging first, and let's go to the categories class definition, and we can see we have different properties here. In our case, we want to decorate the name property. like I mentioned, you cannot have a category without a name. So I can decorate with a C# attribute, and that is called required. And I can do a control dot to import namespace, which is under component model.dataAnnotations. Now, with this attribute added to the property, we can run our application again and see what kind of difference this makes. Let's go to category here. Notice that the name comes back. That's because we are using the in-memory data store. Every time you run the application, the default categories will show up. Right? All of the changes that you made in the previous run will be gone. So let's click on, let's say, the same category here. And now let's delete the name again and click on the Save button. Of course, we're going to see the same problem. The name is still now. But if we go to the watch window here, and let's type in model state. So this is an object that is defined within the controller class. If we look at the value of is valid and it says false, validation state is invalid. So what this means is that although the controller is still handling the request, the controller actually knows that the form values are not valid. And it's up to the developer to handle that invalid request over here. So what we need to do, first of all, of course, we need to stop debugging. Secondly, we will need to check the model state here. So we can use is valid here. Only when the model state is valid do we actually go ahead and update the category and then do the redirection. Now, what should we do if the model state is invalid? Where do we want the user to go? Of course, we need user to see the same category page. And on that category page, we need to see error message so that the user has the opportunity to correct his or her mistake. So therefore, just like any action method, if we want to show the view, we just return the view, just like this. And we feed the category into the view, combine them together, generate the HTML. And because we have the category here, so the user can see the data that he or she entered, and then has the opportunity to correct the mistake. And now when we run the application, and go to categories, go to beverage, and try to delete the name again, you can see that we redirected back to the category page. We don't see the name, but we don't see the error message also. However, if we manually go to the categories page, you can see that the change is not actually made. So the only missing step here is to display proper error message. And let's go ahead and do that. Let's jump back to Visual Studio. This time, we need to go to the view. So right-click on the Add Method and click on Go to View here. The view is the place where we can make changes to display the error message. And guess what? We use tag helpers to help us to display error message. So we can have a div on the top, and we can use tag stinger to display the error message in red. And we are going to use ASP-validation-summary here. And here we want to use all because we want to display all type of error messages. The other one that is available is model only. So this shows only the error messages comes from the model. I suggest that we always use all so that we display all type of error messages. Now we have the summary for displaying the error message. We also want a specific error message beside field name here. So for that, we can add another div right here. And this time we can use the column class. So this one is going to choose a size automatically because we are not specifying the size number. So here we're going to use span, and then we can still use the same class here, which is text danger. And here we can use application validation for. And for which field, of course, in this case, it's for the name field. And then let's close the span element properly, and let's run the application again. Now let's go to categories, and this time let's go to meat, and let's delete the name of the meat. And now we can see the error message summary on the top and error message for the specific field. So if we have more than one field, all of the error message will be displayed on the top, this in the summary area. and then individual error messages will be displayed just beside the field. So in this video, we covered form validation with data annotations. To do that, let's summarize. First step, we need to use data annotations to decorate the properties. Then there's different attributes you can use. Some of them you can use to limit the range. For example, if you have a number, let's say age, you want the age to be greater than 0, so you want to put a validation attribute for that. You can go to Microsoft documentation to find all of the available attributes for data annotation type of validation and use them accordingly. That's the first step, right? Use the attribute to decorate properties of the model class. Secondly, we go to controllers and check the model state. The third step is that we need to go to view and put a validation summary. If you want to see the summary on the top or on the bottom or on both places, and then you can display individual error messages right beside each field if you want the user to see them. So that's everything I want to cover in this video. I will see you in the next one. This video is an assignment video. In this assignment, you need to complete the add category functionality. So here are some requirements and some hints. So on the categories page, you will need to add a add button over here. And when the user clicks on the add button, you will need to redirect the user to add category page with the name and description empty. And when the user clicks on the submit button, of course, you will add the category to the in-memory data store. For example, if I say category number 1, the description is category number 1 as well, and then I click on the submit button, it will create the category in the in-memory data store and then redirect the user back to the categories page where you see a list of categories and you must see your newly added category show up in the list. Another thing that you need to pay attention is that while the user tries to click on the submit button to submit the category, you will need to do your validation. Right? So for example, if I don't enter anything and click on the submit button, I have to have this name field validation show up right here. Okay, so all of these are the requirement. And here are some tips. When working on MVC applications, these are the steps that I suggest you to follow. These are also the steps that I personally follow when I work on MVC applications. So with M, V, and C, I suggest you to change that order to M, C, and V. So first you will create your model, and then you work on your controller. Right? The controller handles the request. Right? Once you finish your controller, you go ahead and implement your view. Sometimes you need to jump back and forth between the controller and view, but most of the time you can complete your controller and then you work on your view. Of course, in this case, we have already created a model, which is the category model. You just need to focus on creating the controller and then the view. Okay, that's everything I want to cover in this video. And you can start with your assignment, and hopefully this assignment helps you exercise most of the concept that you have learned so far in this course. I'll see you in the next video. In this video, let's work on the assignment. Like I mentioned in the previous video, I suggest you to work with this sequence: the model, the controller, and the view. And since we are working with categories and the model has already been created, so let's first focus on creating the controller. Well, we already have the controller class, so when I say controller, what I really mean is the action method or action methods. So first of all, just like when we implementing the edit page, we need a pair of controller action methods. A action method that handles the HttpGet, which is this one, and then another one that handles the HttpPost. So therefore, let's add these two action methods, and let's start with the HttpGet. For HttpGet, we do not need to specify the attribute. So by default, an action method without the attribute is the one that handles HttpGet. So here we can just call it add, and then we don't need any parameters because we don't need to handle any information here. The form will be empty. Here we just need to return to the view. And we don't need to specify the name of the view because we are going to create a view with the same name as the action method. Of course, you can specify the name of the view if you want. So here we implemented the controller action method already. The next step is that we need to implement the view. The first view we will need to work on is the index view, where we will need to add a add button, and that add button will use this action method that we just added. So let's go ahead and implement that. Let's scroll all the way down to the bottom, and then let's add a line break here. And after that, we can add a button. So are we going to use this button element? No, this is going to be a link, so we can use an anchor element. And with the anchor element, we can specify that this link actually looks like a button. How do we do that? We use a bootstrap class. So button and button primary. Next thing, we're going to specify where this link will go to. And as we have learned before, we're going to use the tag helpers. ASP controller. We specify which controller is going to handle this. So of course, it's going to be the categories controller. And then we're going to specify the action, and this is going to be the add action. And now we can specify the caption. And the next view we're going to work on is the actual add view. To do that, we can right click on the action method. And then let's click on add view. Now select razor view empty. Now we just need to make sure the name of the view corresponds to the name of the action method. Okay, let's click on save. And this view is going to be really similar to the edit view. Therefore, we can just copy and paste this whole thing to the add view. Here, of course, we will need to change the title section to show just add category. There's going to be no name to be displayed. Now, inside the form, we do not have the category ID, right? Because we're dealing with a new category. So therefore, we don't have the category ID. We don't need to worry about it. And we have two fields, a name and a description. And now we have the submit button. The type is submit, but the value, we will need to change it to add. So this is the caption of the button. And when this button is clicked on, the form will have to be posted back to the controller. So who's going to handle that? We have to change this action to add. Now, I mentioned in the previous video, we will need to take care of the validations. But because we have just copy and pasted, so we have the summary, and we have the individual validation error messages beside each field. So we don't need to worry about anything else. Now, the next thing is to implement the next action method. That's why I said that sometimes you need to jump back and forth between the view and the controller, but I suggest you to start with the controller. So now let's go to the controller. And we will need to implement the next one, which is the action method that handles the HttpPost. And Visual Studio knows what I tried to do, so it actually generated the code for me. So I don't have to specify where this comes from, but if I want, I can specify that this comes from the form, right? I don't have to do because ASP.NET Core will loop through all of the possible sources and be able to do the model binding correctly. I will remove this. Now, inside the action method, for anything that handles HttpPost, first thing first, without thinking about anything else, we will need to make sure that data comes from the model binding is valid. So therefore, we're going to say if model state is valid, then we can do something. What are we going to do? We are going to use the categories repository to add category. And then we can just simply feed the parameter category to the repository. And when everything is successful, we're going to redirect to action. Not the add action. We can redirect back to the indexed action. It's up to you. If you want to redirect back to the add action, allowing the user to continuously add categories, that's fine. But in this case, like I mentioned in the previous video, the requirement is that you redirect the user back to the list of categories, right, to that page. Now, guess what should you do if the model state is invalid? Just like what's suggested by Visual Studio, you will need to return back to the same view. Here, because we are not specifying which view we're going to go to, it's going to go to the view with the same name as the action method. And we are feeding this parameter to the view. So therefore, if you input something wrong, that wrong data will still be there, allowing the user to correct the mistake. So let's review to see whether we have done everything correctly. We have 2 action methods added, and we have add view added over here. We implement the title section, and here actually we don't need to verify whether the model is null or not null, because we're not relying on the model anymore. And seeing this, maybe we can go back and add some defensive coding in the added view here. Sorry about jumping to this point. We have tested that the model shouldn't be null for this, but we haven't tested the model shouldn't be null for the form. So let's just be defensive and add this as well. So run the whole form with it. So this is going to make sure it's actor safe. Okay, let's come back to the add view and continue. So we don't have to surround this with whether the model is going to be null or not, because we don't have a model yet. Okay, I think we have implemented this correctly, and let's give it a try. If it's not correct, we can just go ahead and correct the mistakes. When we are coding real-world project, it's impossible to always get everything right with the first try. So being a good programmer or being a good software developer means that we have to have one of the most important skills, which is to be able to debug efficiently. Okay, this is the home page. Let's go to categories, and we can see our add button over here. Let's click on the add button, and it takes us to the add category page. That's very good. And let's click on the add button to make sure the validation is triggered. Okay, the validation is triggered. The problem is that we see that the description field is also required. But if we go to the categories model here, we can see that we did not actually specify that description is required. That's because by default, ASP.NET Core application enables nullable. Click on the project, and then we can see the project file. We can see that nullable is enabled by default. That's a good thing. We don't have to disable it. But in order to actually make this description not required, right, optional, we can use a question mark over here. And when we do that, let's go back to the application again. Let's click on the add button again. And let's click on this add button. Now you can see that the only thing that is required is the name field. Okay, so validation also works. And let's add this. So I'm going to use category 1 as well. And here I'm also going to use category 1. Or maybe add something else. Description. And now let's click on the add button to see whether the post method works. Okay, so category number 1 is added over here. And we can also see whether we can edit it. Okay, so we can add this, or maybe we can just delete the whole thing. And click on the save button. Now our category 1 is changed as well. So everything works as expected. I hope you have also completed your category add functionality successfully. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video. In this video, let's learn about using JavaScript in ASP.NET Core MVC application. So the scenario is that we want to delete this category 1 in our categories list, which we added in the previous video. We need to add a delete button over here, and when the user clicks on the delete button, this category will be deleted. But before it's deleted, we need to warn the user, ask him or her to confirm whether he or she really wants to delete the category. So that's where we need to use JavaScript. And let's think in the model, controller, and view MCV order. We already have the model. So next is the controller. What type of controller is that? It's going to be a HttpGet controller. So when the delete button, let's imagine there's a delete link over here, right? When the user clicks on that delete link, we are going to redirect that user to a place where the delete action method will be called. So let's go ahead and implement that delete action method. Let's go to the controller and then let's add a action method here and let's call it delete. Here, we need to know which category to delete. Therefore, we're going to pass in the category ID. And once we have the category ID, we can then use the categories repository to delete it. So pass in the category ID like this, and then we are just going to redirect to the index page. And from the index page, we can verify that the category is deleted or not. We have implemented the controller action method. This next step, we're going to work on the view. So in the view of the index page, we are going to add another column. So in the header, it's going to be just a empty header. And over here, we're going to add another TD. And here, it's going to be a link. So we're going to use the anchor tag. And it's just going to be the same bootstrap class as the added link. Now, we are going to take the user to the delete action method. So therefore, we specify the controller first, which is the categories controller. Now, the action, which is the delete action we just implemented. Now we need to pass in the ID and just like the added button. And we're going to specify ASP, ROT, and specify category ID like this. So I'm going to say category.category ID. And here, the caption is going to be just delete. So with this change, when the user clicks on this delete button, ASP.NET Core is going to use the categories controller, the delete action, fit in the category ID, right? So it's exactly this one. And then it's going to go ahead and delete the category. The problem is that we want to ask the user to confirm whether the delete is intentionally or a mistake. So for that, we need to run a JavaScript. And the easiest way to do that is that we trigger a confirm, right, a pure JavaScript confirm dialog. But this is a view, right? How do we add JavaScript over here? Remember, everything inside here will be rendered in the render body placeholder. So let's go to the layout file. So I'm going to control comma, layout, and double click on here. Now we have the render placeholder, render body placeholder right over here. So if we put any JavaScript in this file, it's going to be just inside this div. And that's not really what we want. The best practice to render JavaScript file is to render that just right before the body closes, right before this tag, so that it doesn't affect the performance of rendering the actual content. For that, we can use a section like this. Remember, a section is a place where we specify in the layout file, and then in any of the views that uses this layout file, we can specify the content that will eventually go into this section, replace this section in the layout file. So therefore, we can add another section, and we can use the async way to render section. You can see we have render section and render section async. I want to use the async version here because we may have a lot of script to render, so I use async version to improve the performance. Here the first parameter is the name of the section, which is later will be used in individual views to refer to the section. So I'm going to say this is a script section, and then I need to make sure I mark this one as not required. Only the ones that actually need to render JavaScript will use the section. Other views that don't need JavaScript don't have to use this section. So therefore I say required is false. So now I have the section defined in the layout file. I will then go ahead and go to the index view where I need to use the section to render some JavaScript. Do you remember how to use a section? Use @, and then we say section, and then we specify the name of the section, which is script. And then we use curly braces. So within here, we can write HTML. And here we use the script tag, and inside the script tag, we define the JavaScript functions. So I'm going to define a confirmed delete function. And inside here, I can simply just call the confirm JavaScript function. And I'm going to just ask, are you sure you want to delete this category? And after that, I will have to use this confirm delete JavaScript function inside this anchor tag. So here, I'm going to say onClick, and then I'm going to say return confirm delete. And that's it. Before we run the application, let's review the code here. I can see that I have a typo here, so instead of confirm, it should be confirm. And then let's go ahead and run the application test out. Alright, so we're looking at our categories page, and we have lost our category 1 because we have rerun the application. But we can delete any of the category. Before we do that, let's go to developer console. And let's see, we have the script section over here that rendered. So we have this confirm delete, right? And then if we check this delete button, we can see that we have this onClick rendered over here. So this function will be triggered, this particular one. So let's click on, let's say, the second one, bakery. Then we can see our confirmation dialog over here. If we click on cancel, nothing is going to happen. If we click on yes, are you sure you want to delete this category? If we click on OK, then you can see that the category is deleted. So we can try again. Delete the bakery. OK, bakery is deleted. Last one, if we say cancel, then it just comes back, nothing is happening. To summarize what we have learned in this video, we have actually gone through the whole process of model controller view, and we created a delete action. We triggered a delete action with this delete button. We implemented a delete button with tag helpers. And then we learned something new, which is using the section to render JavaScript. In this case, we implemented confirm delete function that internally uses the confirm JavaScript function to prevent the user from deleting the category if the user says cancel. That's everything I want to cover in this video, and I will see you in the next one. In this video, let's learn about using partial views to deduplicate code. So far, we have created some code duplications, if you have noticed. Let's go to our Solution Explorer, and let's look at the views. So we have added the added view and the add view. Both of them actually looks almost exactly the same. At least the form part looks almost exactly the same. And that's not ideal. ASP.NET Core provides us several ways to centralize our code so that we can remove duplications. And one of the ways is called partial views. And that's what we are going to use in this video. And the goal is to use partial view to represent this whole part, right? This whole form part. And so that we can replace this with the partial view. And also we can replace this form part with the partial view. So let's go ahead and create a partial view. To do that, we can go under our categories folder because our partial view is not actually globally shared outside of the categories folder. If we do need a partial view that is globally shared, then we can put that partial view under the shared folder. We can go ahead and create a partial view. Just add a view per normal and click on add. Now the convention is to name any partial view with an underscore, just like underscore layout. So let's go ahead and do underscore category and click on the add button. This underscore here doesn't do anything. It's just visually telling us that this is not a normal view. It's a special view, and in this case, it's a partial view. Here we can remove existing code blocks. We're going to use our category model class. And then we can go to our edit view over here and copy this whole thing and paste it. Now, although the edit view and the add view, they look almost exactly the same, there's still some differences. The first place that is different is this action. In the edit view, this is called edit, and in the add view, this is called add. And the second difference is that in the added view here, you can see we have an input field, which is a hidden field, to store the ID of the category. So somehow in our partial view, we have to be able to handle both cases. That means in our partial view, we have to know whether this partial view is used by the add view or the edit. And to do that, we can use our controllers to pass in the information. So for example, let's go to our categories controller here. And we have learned that this add handles the HttpGet request. And this edit also handles the HttpGet request. And with the HttpGet request, the partial view will be loaded. So therefore, within this controller action method here, we can provide the information and pass the information to the partial view. And what we can use is something called a viewback. And here we can just provide anything we want because it's all dynamic. So I'm going to say there is an action variable here in the viewback, and the value of the viewback is going to be edit in this case because we're trying to access the edit view. And similarly over here in the add method, also going to use our viewback, but this time the action variable's value is going to be add. We have this information, then we can access the information over here in the categories partial view. How do we do that? We can use a C# code block here, and we can declare a variable, which is going to be a string, and we can call it action. That corresponds to the viewback action variable here. So if we don't have anything in the action variable, then we can just assign an empty string to the action variable over here. And now we have the information from the controller in the action variable here. We can use it right here. And how do we do that? Remember, there's something called implicit expression. So we can use that. We can use @ and then the action variable, which is defined right over here. And also, we want to render this hidden field when the action variable has the value edit. So I'm going to say action to lower equals edit. And only when this is true do we render the hidden field like this. Now we have dealt with the two differences, right? The action method name and rendering of the hidden field here. Now how do we use this partial view? We're going to use it in the actual view here to replace this. So let's delete everything from here. And now we can use a tag helper. And this time the tag helper is not actually attribute of existing HTML element. It by itself appears as an element. And we can provide a name. And the name is just the name of that file, which is _category. Okay, so _category. And then we will need to provide the model. So this model is what is bound to this particular view. And we can access that @ model. And we're going to do the same thing over here in the edit view. I'm going to deduplicate by replacing this line with the partial view. So name is again _category. And I'm going to pass in the model. So I'm going to say model equals model. And that's it. So now you can see that the edit view and the add view becomes very much simplified. And all of the code in the view is centralized in the partial view. And obviously there's so much benefit. One of them is that when we need to make changes, we don't have to make changes in different places. Okay, let's give it a try. just to make sure everything we have done so far still works. Okay, let's go to our categories and let's try to add a category. Let's still use the same name that we used before, and let's just use anything. It doesn't matter. Let's click on Save button, and it's actually working. Right, it worked. And let's click on Edit, and we see all of the information. That means at least the partial view is being rendered. And let's click on, let's change this over here to 111777, just some random numbers. And then let's click on Save button, and it's also being saved. We can go back and verify. You can see that everything is saved properly. So in this video, we have learned to use partial view to deduplicate. And in the partial view, we have learned to use the viewback to pass information from controllers. And then we use the information to control what we want to render in the partial view. Another thing that we learned is that we learned to use the partial tag helper to render the partial view. That's everything I want to cover in this video, and I will see you in the next one.